Okay, so we're pleased to see Isobel Williams and John Dudeney joining us. They're going to tell us about an intriguing polar person, Sir Clements Markham. The title of their piece is, I think it's intriguing as well. It's both Loveable and Malignant, which covers a wide scope. The format will be sort of discussion and interview. So we've got 40 minutes to find out about Sir Clements Markham. Any questions that arise during it, please continue to post them, and we'll have time at the end to put the questions to Isobel and John. So please, thanks for joining us, and hope you're all set to fill in the blanks on this particular canvas. Okay, so maybe I'll start with the question. I think, Isobel, this one is probably for you. Could you tell us a little bit about Sir Clements' early life and his formative years?
Well, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the family. They came from Nottinghamshire, and they moved to Ireland for financial reasons, apparently, in the 1600s. They settled in Kilkenny and Kilsale. They seem to have recovered very quickly. Clements' grandfather was the secretary to Warren Hastings in India, and his great uncle was an archbishop. However, probably the most important member of the family was the Archbishop Markham, who lived from 1790 to 1807. He was extremely intelligent, and he was seen to be extremely intelligent from a very early age. And his father, a major in the army, moved with him from Ireland to London and enrolled him in Westminster School so that he could have a really good education to benefit from his intelligence. He did very well in Westminster School and then went on to Oxford. And in fact, his upward trajectory seemed to continue uninterrupted. He became Archbishop of Canterbury. Sorry, I've said that before. Archbishop of York, headmaster of Westminster, and very importantly, from Clements' point of view, he became the tutor to the future George IV and William IV. And in 1925, William IV offered a canonship at Windsor to Clements' father, the Reverend David Markham. So that meant that for 1 month of each year, the family went to Windsor, where Clements' father was a canon. And his parents, the Reverend Markham and his wife, dined every week with the King and Queen. And of course, they were obviously a very successful family in their own right, but this introduction and this connection moved them even into the higher echelons of society. Clements was actually born in Stillingfleet in Yorkshire, and I think it was a very happy family. They seemed to have many house parties. Their cousins came, and they had a very, very happy childhood, I think. And when he was 8, they moved to Great Hawkesley, which is near Chichester. His father got, I think, a promotion, a bigger parish, and he was sent away to school. He went to Cheam School, where he was taught by the Pestalozzi method, and also he continued in his lifelong habit of making notes and filling up a journal of everyone he met. Every member of the school was written about in the school. He then went to Westminster, which he absolutely loved. He thought it was wonderful. The education seems to be simply classical and religious, which I'm not sure was very good for his future writing career. But he absolutely loved Westminster. But he was only there for 2 years because of his connections. He was asked to a dinner party with his great aunt, the Countess of Mansfield, and during the evening he sat next to Sir George Seymour, who was about to take over the Pacific Station, a tour of 4 years. Sir George asked Clements if he would like to join the Navy. Sir Clements, aged 14, said yes, and off he went to the Navy, and that was the end of his official education.
Okay. Okay, so that's fascinating. So we have this story of someone very, classically educated. The family had come from sort of rags to riches, or from bad luck to good fortune, dining with the king and so on. So that's so we have Sir Clements now asked to join the Navy. So maybe, is it John? I think you can tell us a little bit about the next steps in the Navy.
Yes, his entry into the Navy was unusual. Isobel has just alluded to that a little bit. He was very, very well connected, as she's pointed out. So he often had lunch with his great aunt, the Countess of Mansfield. And at one of these lunches, he was sat next to the Admiral Sir George Seymour, who just invited him there and then to join his Pacific Fleet that he was about to depart on HMS Collingwood to take the command of. And at the age of 14, that's exactly what Markham did. Now, this is a pretty unusual way of getting into the Navy, and he joined as a cadet. And not only that, but while he was in the Navy, particularly while he was part of the Pacific Fleet for 4 years, he had some extremely unusual relationships with more senior officers. In particular, on the ship was Beauchamp Seymour, who was the nephew of the Admiral. He was his flag officer and his aide-de-camp. And he basically shared his cabin most days with Markham. Now, the Navy at the time was very, very, very strict. This seems to have been an extremely unusual way of conducting naval business on a ship. I don't know of any example of this happening normally. Also, whenever they were in port, because he had this close relationship with the Seymour family, he would get entertained in the family house ashore in Valparaiso, where Seymour's family were, and taken on trips. So it must have been a very odd relationship on the ship between him and his fellow cadets and midshipmen. He was also very against corporal punishment, which of course was still the main way of dealing with discipline in the Navy at the time. And that was one of the things that turned him against the Navy, I think. And so that he didn't make a full-time career of it, although he was always very interested in naval affairs, knew many, many admirals. Many of his colleagues in the 1840s and 50s in the Navy became very senior officers, and he would often get invitations to sail on Navy ships. In fact, one of those was when he was able to go on a trip to the Arctic during the expedition in 1872, with Captain Nares. So he kept his link with the Navy throughout his career. And of course, as we'll probably talk about later, the way in which Scott became the leader of the first British Antarctic expedition in 1904 was very much through Markham's interest in junior naval officers.
Okay. Just did he specialize in anything particularly in the Navy? So we have this person who wrote in his notebooks and recorded everything that happened. Did he continue doing that? And did he specialize in anything such as navigation or anything like that?
No, I don't think he specialized particularly, but he did continue to maintain this very detailed account of everything that happened to him and all the people around him. And that's something he maintained throughout his life. And his diaries, which I've read extensively for the latter part of his life, are fascinating documents in themselves. Okay. Not only are they a mine of information, they're works of art, because he was quite a geographer. And whenever he traveled anywhere, he would draw maps, which seemed to me to be quite sort of geographically accurate of the places he had visited. He would also draw careful architectural drawings of buildings that he found particularly interesting in his travels. Okay. And so his diary writing was really quite amazing.
Okay, that's great. So now we have the picture. He's been on the Nares expedition. Did something happen then? Did he stay in the Navy? What happened?
No. What happened? He he was in the Navy until the early 1850s. He qualified as a midshipman, and he joined one of the expeditions to search for Franklin's lost ships, and wintered in the Antarctic. In the Arctic. Actually wintered in Lancaster Sound on HMS Assistance, and there he did quite a few sledge journeys in the winter, man hauling, and that's where he got this remarkable view about the importance of traveling unaided, of man hauling in the polar regions. And he's quoted as saying, "Dogs are worse than useless. In my mind, no journey made with dogs can approach the height of that high conception which is raised when a party of men go forth to face hardships, dangers, and difficulties with their own unaided effort. Surely in this case, the conquest is more nobly won." And that's a really interesting background to what subsequently was to happen with the Antarctic voyages of Scott, of course.
Okay.
And so, no, he left the Navy. He didn't specialize in any particular area, as far as I know. He left the Navy partly because of the problems of discipline, which he disliked, and partly because he had other things he wanted to do.
Yes, he decided when he'd been with around the Pacific, that he decided he didn't want the career in the Navy. He wanted to be a geographer and explorer, and he was very keen on that.
Okay.
So at quite a young age, he decided, well before he left.
And I know it's not on our list of questions, so maybe just a quick piece around. I know there's a Peruvian episode. Does anyone want to take that?
I think Isabel's best to talk about that.
Yeah.
He went to Peru on 3 occasions. He first of all went in Collingwood when he saw, this is when he decided he wanted to become a geographer, and he was very interested in the countries he went to, and particularly interested in Peru and the Incas. He then went back when he left the Navy. His father gave him £500, a large amount in that time, and he went to Lima. He went through before the canal was made, so a difficult journey. And he spent a month or so in Lima, looking at all the buildings he could, learning as much as he could about the history of Peru, and also learning the language of the ancient Incas called Quechuan. And after a month, he journeyed to Cusco, which is the headquarters, the capital of the Inca Empire. And it was a very difficult journey. It's very impressive. I mean, he was still quite young. He went on a mule. He had to go along the coast. He had to go across the Andes, the coastline, the Puna, the High Sierra, and the mountains. And he got to Peru. Got to the capital of the Inca Empire, and he was thrilled. He spent a month there. He could have only had money to spend a month there. So he was there for a month, examining all he could, and also examining going around the local villages and towns. And it was on this expedition that he first heard of the cinchona tree, which has quinine in its bark, and it was the only cure available for malaria. He couldn't do anything about it at the time. He had to go home, but he always remembered this. He returned to Peru when he was working in the India office, and his attention was drawn to the incidence of malaria in the southern continent. And he arranged, with the support of the Secretary of State for India, an expedition, a very dangerous expedition, to go back to Peru to collect specimens of the cinchona, seeds and saplings of the cinchona tree, and transport them, first of all, to England, and then to suitable sites in India, where they did in fact flourish. And the price of quinine went down dramatically over the next few years. So he really had got his place in heaven due to this expedition. He took 4 people with him, and they worked extremely hard in extreme danger, because the Peruvian authorities were very keen that they shouldn't take the samples of the cinchona tree out of Peru.
Okay, I think that's just a fascinating story, and particularly where we are now with something like COVID. You know, if we look back at malaria, and here he is, he's managed to find a solution and drop the price of the drug on the international market, if you want to put it that way. So it's really interesting.
It went down by a factor of 25, I think.
Wow. Okay, Big Pharma wouldn't have been happy.
Oh no.
If we then, I mean, the next, I think, piece I'd like to ask about is really his driving the interest in Antarctic exploration. And, you know, he is sort of, in some descriptions, he's the father of Antarctic exploration, as I've heard it. So maybe, John, can you fill us in on him?
Yeah, he was a long-term and very enthusiastic advocate of the Royal Navy's involvement in exploration. He took the view, first of all, that any exploration that was done should be done by the British Empire. Secondly, that it should be done by the Royal Navy. And third, that it should be done by young, inexperienced Royal Naval officers. It's a curious outlook. But I think his interest in in polar region started with his trip to the Arctic, when he went on the search for Franklin ships. And then again, some years later, when he went on the Nares expedition. And that got him interested in trying to break the logjam that had occurred in funding for polar explorations because of the disaster of the Franklin expedition. And so when he became president of the Royal Geographical Society in 1893, that really became the focus of his presidency, to start Britain involved again in Antarctic research, in particular, and Antarctic exploration. And it's interesting that Hugh Robert Mill, who was the librarian of the Royal Geographical Society, took quite an interesting view of Markham during his presidency. He said he was more of a dictator than a president in determining policy and appointing members to council, reflecting the impulses and prejudices of his impetuous enthusiasms. But certainly one of those impetuous enthusiasms was to get Britain involved and leadership in new Antarctic research. And the first thing he did after his inauguration as president of the Royal Geographical Society was to convene a special meeting to discuss the possibilities for polar exploration and research. And he fingered John Murray, later Sir John Murray, the oceanographer, to give a keynote speech at that gathering. And interestingly enough, our old friend William Spears Bruce was at that gathering as well. And so that was where it started. And he took his message then to the International Geographical Association meeting in 1895, where he managed to get the assembled company to pass a resolution, basically saying that the most important thing that could be done would be Antarctic research. And so he was then trying to get money, of course, for an Antarctic expedition. And that was not easy, because the government was really not interested in funding Antarctic research or any sort of polar research. And it was only when, in fact, he tried to get the money through private donations and was not getting anywhere at all, really. And it was only when he got a single large donation of £25,000 from Llewellyn Longstaff that things started to change. And then he got the Royal Society and the Royal Geographical Society together and sent a delegation to the government to see, they hoped to see the Prime Minister, but in fact they ended up, by luck, not seeing the Prime Minister, but seeing the Lord Privy Seal, as he was at the time, Balfour, in 1899, to try and plead for the expedition to go ahead. And Balfour was a man who took a great interest in science and therefore was more likely to be interested. But in particular, there was a figure in government who is not known about at all, really, who was very crucial. In fact, without his intervention, the funding would probably not have come for the Discovery expedition. This was a guy called Sir Francis Moat. Sir Francis Moat was the permanent secretary of the Treasury. at the time. And so he also was part of listening to this delegation. And he took the view that this was really interesting, that he consulted the secretaries of the Royal Society, who also said that the science that could be done would be fascinating and important. He particularly took the view that magnetometry measurements to aid navigation in the Southern Ocean would be very important. But there's a lovely quote that we found in the government papers from him about this, where he said that he found it difficult to view the proposal through Treasury spectacles. And of course, he was the man who would make a recommendation to government as to whether the funding should go ahead. And he pointed out to the government, first of all, that the Germans were already funding an expedition, and therefore that was an important feature that needed to be taken into account. And he thought the importance of the science was very big, and it was therefore his intervention that really got the money. Had he not taken a personal interest, almost certainly the Treasury would have said no.
Right.
Because they didn't like funding things in those days.
Okay.
But there's a sting in the tail about this, because, as you know, when in 1903 the expedition needed money to send a relief ship, this became a real cause célèbre, and actually Moat and Balfour became Markham's nemesis, because they were very, very unhappy about being asked for more money. They really didn't want to do it at all. And the only way they would do it was if the ship Morning, which was owned by the Royal Geographical Society, was handed over lock, stock and barrel to the government. Now, Markham was adamantly against this. He was prepared to let them have it for the rescue mission, but he was adamantly against losing the ship. But Markham had an unusual characteristic. He liked to go on long trips to Europe every year with his wife, Minna. He liked to go there because he had a great interest in the minor royal houses of Europe. He would go and draw very detailed family trees of these royal houses in his diary, and he would spend months doing, and also visiting various spas for his health. And he left London before this issue had been resolved, having left instructions with the RGS. They were not under no circumstances to hand the ship over. But while he was away, the Council of the Royal Geographical Society elected an interim president and then just countermanded his orders. So when he came home, the ship had been handed over to the Royal Navy, to the Treasury, and that was the beginning of the end of him in the president's seat. In fact, that was the beginning of his disillusionment. Sorry, I've gone on quite a long while.
No, that's
Kevin, can I just add one bit to what John said?
Please, Isobel. Yeah.
That in Sir John Murray's address, he said, "A dash to the pole is not what I advocate. Painstaking scientific work." And this set the scene for the Royal Society and the whole problem between the Royal Society and the Royal Geographical Society.
Okay. Yeah.
Although he had to take the Royal Society, so he needed government support,
Yes.
and he had to take the Royal Society with him when he went to appeal to the government, as John has said. He realised later it had been a terrible mistake because their ambitions in the pole were so different to his.
Okay, and I think that explains a lot. You know what I mean, in what happened and in expeditions that followed. Maybe, I mean, given the topic, given we're the Shackleton Autumn School, maybe you could tell us he would have come across Ernest Shackleton on Discovery. And can you tell us a little bit about his relationship with Ernest Shackleton, what he thought of him first, what he thought of him middle, and what he thought of him later?
I can certainly do that.
Great.
It's clear. I've made a very careful study of his entries in his diary over several years about Shackleton. And we heard some interesting stuff this morning from Joe Wolfe about his early views of Shackleton and how effusive he was when Shackleton applied for the job of Secretary of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. So to begin with, he had a very warm relationship with Shackleton. When Shackleton got back from the Discovery expedition in 1903, he was often entertained by Markham at his home. As Joe pointed out, he assisted in getting Shackleton the job. And Shackleton seems to have been somewhat of a confidant with Markham during this business with the mourning and the rescue mission. Also, he bought Shackleton a wedding present when he married Emily, and he would have attended the wedding, his wife did, but for medical advice.
Oh.
Things seemed to start going wrong when Shackleton started up his own expedition in 1906, the Nimrod expedition, and particularly when a dispute occurred over who had rights to McMurdo Sound. And that was where things really started to go badly. Now, it came to the point where you may know the story of Captain England, who was the captain of Shackleton's ship, the Nimrod, who had a very serious falling out with Shackleton. Shackleton lost confidence in him. And when England arrived back in England, he went and complained to Markham about Shackleton's behavior. And this is the first time where Shackleton vents his spleen in his diary about, when Markham vents his spleen in his diary about Shackleton. And he writes, Shackleton seems to have turned out to be a malignant, underhand cad, much disappointed in him. That was from 1909. And in his diary entry on hearing of Scott's death, they referred to Shackleton as a contemptible self-seeker.
Cool.
And he wrote a very interesting volume, which I recommend people have a look at if they can. It's in the Royal Geographical Society's archives. It's called Clements Markham, His Antarctic Book. And it has everything that Markham thought he knew about the Antarctic in it, plus mini biographies of all of the major players. And what he wrote about Shackleton is very illustrative. Applied to Captain Scott to take him on discovery. He had no scientific qualifications, but was taken out of kindness and partly owing to his importunity. He had charge of the holds and serving out of rations. He was taken on Scott's southern journey. He broke down and endangered the lives of others. Scott and Wilson saved his life. He was sent home invalid on the morning. In 1906, raised funds and started an expedition of his own. Knowing that Captain Scott was intending to complete his work, Shackleton gave a promise in writing that he would not touch Victoria Land. This is underlined in the book. He went straight there, made a dash to cut out his old chief and failed. Returned, proving himself to be a colourful self-advertiser. Swollen head, written in capitals underlined, and an ungrateful cad. The less said of his subsequent conduct, the better. So you can see that Markham had a very, very, very jaundiced view of Shackleton towards the end. You can make up your own mind between the two characters. They were both very strong characters, but he certainly had no time at all for Shackleton by the time of his death.
Okay, no, that's fantastic. That's really interesting and really great insight into how that relationship sort of went off the rails and I suppose turned sour. We could, and I'll tell you, John, if we're ever filming it, we're going to put you in central casting as well. Your delivery of it was just fantastic, you know. Maybe, Isobel, we'll move on with Sir Clements. His years afterwards, his death, and also really interested in, you know, what's his legacy. And I'm just thinking now, you know, our session today was sort of bookended by John Quiller Rowett, who sponsored that final expedition, maybe of the heroic era. And we have Clements Markham, who was a moving force in the early expeditions. So it's quite interesting just the way that has happened. But maybe if you could tell us a little bit about his later years, his death, and I'd love to know from both of you then ideas of what is his legacy? Why would we think of him now?
Well, he retired from the Royal Geographical Society. He retired as president after the Discovery expedition. He spent time traveling, writing. He was a prolific writer. He wrote over 50 books and, of course, edited many others. But he never really recovered from Scott's death. Scott was like a son to him, and he was very, very upset when Scott died. Now, in 1916, he was reading in his bed in Eccleston Square by candlelight. I don't know why he was reading by candlelight. He had electricity in the house, and he was reading a book on Old Portuguese, and this was on the end of January 1916, the candle slipped, he was engulfed in flames, clawed at his nightshirt. He screamed and screamed, and his butler rushed in, wrapped him in a rug and carried him out. But he was overwhelmed by the flames and the fumes, and he died the next day. And there were many, of course, letters of condolence. Now, shall I go on to what sort of a man he was? Or?
Please do. Yes, Isobel, that'd be great. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure John will agree he had good and bad. He seems to be exception, like all of us, but perhaps in more extreme than most of us. He was exceptionally loving and supportive of those he liked. His cousin, Albert Markham, who wrote a biography of him, said he was terribly kind and generous to those that he liked. But if he didn't like you, there's no hope for you whatsoever. He had a combative energy. He had no diplomacy. He was very, very rude about those in the Royal Geographical Society, those on the Discovery expedition, particularly the members of the Royal Society, who wanted a different outcome of the expedition to the Antarctic. As we've heard, Hugh Robert Mill, who's a Baron, said he was dictatorial. Frank Debenham, who I imagine was a rather gentle man, described him as a dangerous old man. And one of the people on the Bruce's expedition, Rudmose Brown, said he was an old fool and humbug. So he was absolutely, he became very unpopular. And I'm afraid this is a reputation that has perhaps continued, because he did make so many enemies. There's no doubt about it. I think we can consider another aspect of his life, though, which a more positive aspect. He was connected with the Royal Geographical Society for over 60 years, and he did fantastic work for the Royal Geographical Society. As secretary, he really expanded it. He did wonderful work. He supported explorations. He supported all sorts of further explorations, as John has mentioned, but explorations in Africa and other places like that. Mm-hmm. So he worked unceasingly for the Royal Geographical Society, as I say, for over 60 years. And he was indefatigable in promoting its interests. I think we can say he was a man of vision. He got the Cinchona tree, produced the Cinchona tree, produced it in India, and made a tremendous difference to humanity there. His was the Discovery expedition. That was his. It would not have taken place without him. There were very important admirals, but they hadn't got his drive, his ingenuity to manipulate things that he did. The Discovery expedition would not have taken place without him.
Okay.
He did wonderful explorations. I mean, he went to Abyssinia, which we haven't mentioned. He went with John Franklin, and he wrote about these, and he told people about these places. He was also a fantastic writer, as John has mentioned. He wrote over 50 books on all sorts of subjects. I've read them, not read them, but I've read the subjects, biographies, expeditions, history, and so therefore he left a great legacy in that way too. And I think we can say that his overriding ambition was to serve geography in his country, and that I would say was his legacy.
Okay.
I would agree with that. I think he was a towering figure in geography in the United Kingdom, but I'm not sure that I would agree that his influence on Antarctic affairs was really very positive. The Discovery expedition was his, but some of the things that happened and some of the ways that Britain approached Antarctic research, Antarctic exploration, left a lot to be desired. He
wanted geography; they wanted only science. They didn't even want the ship to land. They wanted the ship to drop the explorers off and then go. So there was no geography in their exploration, the Royal Society.
And I think one thing as well that you said, Isobel, which really seems to crystallize it for me, is he didn't have a lot of diplomacy. And you so often get these people, you just get people with drive and vision, and it's great as long as it's everything is going their way. But when it hits the skids, they haven't the diplomacy to pull back and influence. You know what I mean? It's not happening their way, so it's sort of not happening. We see it so often, I think. So that seems to explain a lot. But look, that's been a fantastic run through. It really is, and I think it's really filled in a lot on a person who's often in the shadows, but was very important at very important points. I suppose if we can, there's questions coming in, and I mean, first question that's here as well. We'll get the other questions on the screen, but first question is, I hope you're writing a book on this.
We are trying to write a book. We have sent off an introduction, the first chapter of his youth, and a chapter of the difficulty, the prolonged difficulty between the Royal his requirements for the expedition to Antarctica and the Royal Society's requirements for the expedition on Antarctica. That's a very difficult one because they were clawing at each other. It's remarkable for distinguished men. They were so rude and awful about each other. It's quite a
yeah. We have a proposal with a publisher at the moment, and it's being considered by them.
Yes.
Okay, that's great, and we'd love to. We'll extend the invite now, but when it happens, we'd love if you do an Irish launch of it through the autumn school, and when that comes to pass. We'll get some other questions up. So maybe I'll read them out here to you, but you should be able to see them. Are his diaries at the Royal Geographical Society or elsewhere, or where can somebody?
Yeah, they're the RGS.
Okay.
And they're available from the archive.
And also the family have got a lot, which they've lent us.
Okay.
A lot of information of his personal reminiscences.
Okay, I suppose the question, you might have covered it somewhat, maybe a quick recap. The focus of polar research at the time in political terms.
Well, that's interesting because the government took the view that the really interesting thing for them was the fact that the routes around the Cape Horn were starting to be used for large shipping much more, and that mapping the geomagnetic field would be a really important part that would actually pay a real dividend. Otherwise, they were content to just let the research go ahead rather as blue skies research, which was interesting for the time. But they didn't see any other major advantage to be gained politically or nationally apart from the prestige. At least that's the way you can read the government papers at the time.
Okay. Is another question from Anne Murphy. Yeah, were there many other countries involved in exploration in the Antarctic at that time?
Yes.
You mentioned the Germans.
After his, when he'd been appointed, and they had this great meeting in London in 1895, international meeting, 4 countries went to Antarctica in the early 1900s. Germany, William Spears Bruce went down south, and it was Swedish.
Well, the Northern Swedish expedition. There was Charcot's French expedition,
German,
and Shackleton, not Shackleton.
Gerlach.
Shackleton's expedition in 1907. Yeah. But yeah, there were 5 countries that were heavily involved.
In early 1900s.
Okay, and I suppose the Belgians as well with Gerlach. We can't forget.
Oh yeah, but that's Gerlach, de Gerlach and Borchgrevink as well, both
of course
just prior to the turn of the century. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've time for another question. The last question, maybe. Is there another question, Amanda? Yeah, we're just getting it. Oh, Jonathan Shackleton. Did he ever visit his relations in Ireland?
I'm not sure, but his mother was a Clements.
Yes.
And the family often came to Stillingfleet, and they were Clements, and the Clements were from Ireland, big family in Kilkenny, I think.
Yes,
so I can't say that for definite, but there was a definite association because his grandmother, who was a Clements, his grandmother was a Miss Clements. She lived with him.
Okay.
Lived with David Markham and his wife. So there was a big connection with the family in Ireland.
Something we might very well discover during our further research, particularly into his diaries.
Yeah, I mean, I just know that there was certainly a connection with the Clements family, which is in Kildare at the moment, just outside Celbridge, but they were related to the Earls of Leitrim, and so they were big landowners at one stage. So look, I think we're exactly on time. Oh, sorry, one more question. An interesting question from James Taff. Is Markham worthy of a public memorial or monument for his endeavours?
That's a very, very difficult question to answer.
If you can't answer it, no one can answer it.
I would imagine that there could be a case for something at the Royal Geographical Society itself in terms of a statue in the grounds. I don't know whether there is one. There may be. It's something that I can't answer the question, but he is a very controversial figure. So whether one could really expect to get a unanimity over a monument's another question, I think.
Bob, who runs the polar exploration group, has actually put up twice for him to have a blue plaque in London.
Oh, yeah.
And twice it's been turned down.
Oh, okay.
The second time, because it's now Eccleston is now in flats, so some people didn't want it. But there is an emphasis to try and get a blue plaque for him.
Well, maybe we'll put one up somewhere in Kilkenny or Kildare.
Oh, we've got an answer. We've got an answer. There already is a monument outside the RGS to Markham. So thank you for letting us know.
Sorry, there is one there. And there's a picture of him inside, portrait.
Okay, so look, we're exactly on time. I think Sir Clements would be very happy with his precision and his exactness that we've managed to get through his life and a summary of his life. And it's been a fascinating lecture. And to John and Isobel, just thanks very much for joining us and allowing us the benefit of your research and your information.
Thanks for letting us come.
No, thank you. We'll be back in 10 minutes with Seamus, who's going to introduce some other pieces on the new museum, and that's the new redevelopment of the museum here. And also we'll have Jim McAdam giving a quick run through some plans we have for the centenary year, Ernest Shackleton centenary year. So we'll talk to you in 10 minutes. Don't forget to refresh your screen.